Welcome to my Eye of Winter Deadeye Trapper, a build born out of the need for damage. After 2 builds failed due to critical lack of damage, I had no choice but to forego a well-rounded defensive lair setup for a more glass cannon approach to life. If the enemy dies before we do 6 times, we win. That's just science. Our approach was simple. Stack power charges via void batteries with a badge of the Brotherhood to match those power charges with frenzy charges. Acquire ultimate speed and crit multi via charged trap support, then grab even more speed via Deadeye Tailwind, along with the cool mixture of projectile min-maxing thanks to Deadeye, so that we could truly put the Eye of Winter skill to the test. And I have to say, after playing this skill, I definitely get a distinct ball lightning vibe, where the gem itself isn't very blatantly obvious that its power level is strong, and underneath the hood, it stacks a lot more hits and damage than is there right in front of you. And underneath the hood, it stacks a lot more hits and damage than is visible to the naked eye. Or for all I know, my build carried the skill, and if I swap in Fireball, the build would instantly deal more damage. But I didn't test that, so it shall remain a mystery for now until the end of time, or somebody tests it. Things happen. Moving on, let's talk pros and cons of the build. I want you guys to have all the information to decide whether or not this build is for you. To start off with the pros, it's fairly cheap, only costing a few hundred chaos. This price mostly just follows the cost of 2 void batteries, as they're critical pieces of gear, and they're all the only items that are actually expensive. So if void batteries are fairly cheap, then the build's gonna be fairly cheap. If they spike in price, then this build is gonna spike in price. Another pro is it's been a fairly successful bosser. I've been able to do almost all the bosses in the game, short of the feared, as I haven't tried that yet, which might be too difficult for the build. That being said, it should be noted that although I have done Maven successfully with this build, that I also bricked Maven a couple times today, so that fight requires a bit more skill to pull off, and if you play it poorly, it can go south like it did for me a couple times I tried it, because I did it successfully and I also did it unsuccessfully. Other fights like Shaper, Elder, Uber Zeri, Uber Elder, Guardian Invitations are all pretty within the wheelhouse of viability for this build. We did those pretty cleanly most of the times I tried it, minus 1 Guardian or 2 Guardian Invitations where I rolled them with rare, hard mods, and I kind of choked, but let's not talk about that. Now looking at the cons of the build, the clear speed is fairly mediocre, I would say, so there's nothing really special there. It's not going to be some great clear speed, and maybe that's okay with you, maybe it's not. The sustain mechanic of the build is great while fighting, but the reason this is on the cons list is because the second you fight a boss with an immunity phase, because we require our traps to be triggered to sustain our life pool, that means that if we have a boss with immunity phase, we can't trigger our traps, and therefore we can't sustain our life, and we're just relying on our life flask to survive at that point, and that can feel bad. This is mostly just a problem in fights like Chimera, Eradicator, Maven, and Cirrus, where bosses have immunity phases where they get to attack you and you can't fight back. That's really the problem there. If it's a boss like Minotaur where you get to fight it back against it the entire time, there's not really an issue with the sustain because we get to keep having sustain. And for the biggest con of the build, it's not particularly tanky. It's not the most glass cannon, but because the build does feature defensive layers like Blind, Wind Dancer, and some dodge, it even makes use of 30% less damage taken from Deadeye node Wind Ward. Unfortunately, it still only hits 4k life, and that's just not enough to be consistently tanky, and it will die in red maps randomly here and there if you get shotgunned by enough projectiles or deadly map mods. It's not going to just be consistently tanky, and there'll be some feels badness to that because it's more of a glass cannon, unfortunately. Hopefully that gives you a good picture for the larger scope of what the build is like. It's a good DPS bossing character that's fairly inexpensive, that has the weakness in its clear speed's not great and its defenses are only kind of mediocre. Now that I've given you the overview of the character, let's go in-game and talk over specifics. Welcome to the in-game portion of this guide. First off, let's talk gear. Now I mentioned this in the video to begin with, we're using void batteries. These give us additional power charges. And we're also using a corrupted helmet with a power charge. We just looked for one with life and +1 power charge, and then ideally if we could get a little bit of res with it, that'd be nice. Don't have to look for anything too fancy. I think this costs us around 20-30 C. Something like that will do just fine for you. So we stack +3 power charges here. We'll stack 3 power charges on the tree. That takes us to 9 total, which means Badge of the Brotherhood takes us all the way to 9 frenzies. Thus we get 9 and 9. and it is a very good time for our charged trap support, because our charged trap support gives us 10% throw speed per frenzy and 15 multi per power, which is a huge amount of damage, all within the power of the Amulet, Badge of the Brotherhood, and Void Battery stacking. So something new I want to try for a trapper, and I think it's worked out pretty well. Other gear pieces are rares that we use for res and life are one of our ring slots and our belt slots. So these are just life and res, nothing too special for these two items here. As well as our other ring is just a Malachai's Artifice, which gives us some res, and it also allows us to inflict elemental equilibrium on an enemy, thus subtracting minus 50 res of the cold and fire res if we hit them with Orb of Storms for lightning. You could also do a Stormbrand here if you like Stormbrand more than Orb of Storms. Kind of up to you. Stormbrand would follow a boss around, whereas Orb of Storms is nice for its faster cast time. So that choice kind of up to you. That's what we have for some of the more basic pieces. For our chest piece, we have a Tinker Skin. This is just a great chest piece for a couple reasons. A, it gives us phasing on kill, which is huge for traps. Traps they're kind of awkward while mapping because they have a delay to them. So if we have phasing from killing enemies, we can just walk through, throw traps, walk through enemies, throw traps, walk through enemies, throw traps. If we don't have phasing, then we're much more likely to die because we're going to get stuck on monsters, and Tinker Skin solves that. It also gives recover life and recover ES on trap throws being triggered, which is a hugely strong sustain mechanic. As I mentioned before, it falls short when you get a boss with an immunity phase, but outside of that, it feels quite good to get 100 life per trap you throw and 50 ES per trap you throw. And it works great to sustain our trap throws because we use Eldritch Battery, so that way we can sustain basically our mana and not have mana issues via Tinker Skin. We also use Itziri Step just for a nice well-rounded option of life, evasion, and dodge. You can eventually min-max this obviously for going for influence gear, but I didn't have a ton of currency to put in this character, so I just stuck with these boots, and then I threw the decent lab enchant of movement speed on them when I got it. Ideally, you want to go for something like Pen on these boots, I would say, for the best damage boost, as Pen should be up at all times, as traps don't count as you killing enemies, so it's basically just 10 Pen, which is really good, and I'd recommend grinding a little bit of Uber Lab for it if you can, because it's a big damage boost. So that takes out the boots, the gloves, all our jewelry, and now for the big change that we had to make that made the build cheaper, but also took away some of its min-maxing potential, some of its defensive potential, and that's we don't have Architect's Hands here. Instead, we have a multi-link pair of gloves. Originally, we were going to use Architect's Hands, which gives you cast speed, counts as throw speed, which for us was like something like 60-70% throw speed for our traps. It was very big for additional speed. Unfortunately, we met an unfortunate problem with the character, which is we are too fast. We were suffering from success. Traps have a trap limit, which means there can only be X amount of traps on the ground at a time. For us, currently, it's 24. Originally, I was doing a trap limit of 20. I didn't invest into the passives that give additional traps, but the problem we ran into was traps have an arming time. And the arming time is basically if you can throw your maximum number of traps before the trap even arms, the new trap you try to throw will replace the first trap you threw, and therefore the trap that's closest to being armed gets disabled. So if our trap throw speed is too fast, we basically don't trigger any traps. So what was happening is we had way too much speed, and it was breaking our build essentially. So to adjust for that, we had to actually downgrade our speed and go for a less min-max potential of having multi-link trap gloves. These are kind of cheap. You just get slower proj and trap support, and there you go. You have a nice little 6-link to work with. Not too expensive. You don't even need to 6-link your Tinker Skin. Makes the build cheaper, but unfortunately, it's also less min-max potential, because the potential was we could have this crazy throw speed, have these crazy amounts of traps, but unfortunately, because of trap arming time, that ends up just bricking itself because you throw too many traps and you end up disabling your initial traps, and then, yeah, it's an unfortunate portion that we learned the hard way, And because of that, we ended up having to spec for additional traps and actually anoint things like Master Sapper specifically for the additional traps. We still may need like one more additional trap from cheap construction. We might be just on the brink of throwing traps just a little bit too fast. And as well as we can get a trap and mine support eventually when we craft more min-max gloves, which would be a Essence of Horror crit chance with trap throw speed, Veiled Chaos with suffixes can't be changed till you hit +2 projectile gems, and then craft Unlike Life. That would be more ideal gloves, because then you could go for trap and mine damage support as one of the links potentially, which gives 10% less throw speed, which helps it so you don't brick yourself by throwing traps too quickly. So that's the reason for the glove change. It's a nice change because it makes the build cheaper, and it's also a bad change, unfortunately, that we ran into because we were just too fast with our trap throw speed. So it's a win and a loss at the same time, if that makes any sense. As for our flasks, I went over this in the previous video. I've decided to be ultra lazy this league with the auto trigger flasks, and I set up all these flasks with ailment removals, like remove bleed when you use bleed, remove shock when you get shocked, remove ignite when you get ignite, remove poison when you get poisoned. And then I set all these flasks to keys I never press, so that way I always have the flasks available. Whenever I get ignited, I remove the ignite. This has been a great solution for me to be lazy to not die to random ailments, but at the same time, it's also, we are giving up all our value of flasks. Like, flasks are still great if you want to grab more damage or more defenses and proactively use them. So you're going to have to make that choice for yourself whether or not you want to be this lazy about it. But this was me pretty much being like, I don't want to deal with ailments. I don't want to think about them. I'm just going to disable these flasks for me being able to use them up and just have them always auto-trigger. So that's up to you. We ended up going for a Blood of Karui just because I was tired of randomly dying to boss immunity phases when I couldn't heal myself, and this kind of helped avoid that. It gave up a Quicksilver, so I'm not 100% sure it was worth it, but that's what we did. So that's our flasks. For our gem links are Sniper's Mark, Arcanist Brand, and Frostbomb, and Faster Casting. This is one of our utility setups. Whenever we're doing a boss, we have a few utility setups. This is one of them. We trigger this on a boss to get Arcanist Brand to give us the Sniper's Mark and to give us the Frostbomb for cold exposure. We also previously had Flame Wall attached to this, which was great for 15% more damage. Unfortunately, it makes your eyes bleed. I showcased it in like one clip on Drox and Veritania. It makes your eyes bleed, but it gives you 15% more damage, and it melts your GPU. So it's kind of a trade-off there. We opted to not do it anymore because it was kind of it was just hurting my eyes. So that's up to you. Flame Wall if you want more damage. That is all up to you. This is just a gem I was leveling in my offhand. Okay. I realize now I didn't min-max these gem setups. I basically just had my damage setup, Flame Dash, and my Arcanist Brand setup, so don't judge me too hard on this. For auras, we did Elemental Prolif with Anomalous Arctic Armor. Arctic Armor solved freeze for us, as well as it gives a little bit of a nice defensive boost, and whenever enemies hit us, there's a chance they get frozen, and then that will Prolif to all the enemies around it. It's kind of a nice little feature of if you're about to get shot by a bunch of projectiles, the first guy shoots you, and then he freezes his whole pack of buddies, and that way you don't get hit by all the projectiles. It's kind of nice. It works sometimes. I like it. Also, Summon Skitterbot's just great for damage, get shock effect on bosses, and more damage for trap and mine. Great aura there. And then the last aura we used, I believe, was Flesh and Stone. I was completely spacing on it, but Flesh and Stone for blind on nearby enemies, just some more defensive layers. You could end up trading things like Arctic Armor and you could trade Flesh and Stone and Elemental Proliferation for a Hatred plus Enlighten in the Aura setup, but Enlightens are so expensive, that would just completely skyrocket the build cost, so I didn't really want to do that. Also, we have Hydrosphere. This is so that way, when our Eye of Winter triggers, shoots a bunch of projectiles out, sometimes the projectiles that would miss a boss would then chain off Hydrosphere and still hit the boss. So it was another thing we would set up for more DPS. And then we have Flame Dash with Arcane Surge. Arcane Surge isn't important here. I linked this up on the early stages of the build back when I was planning to eventually become the Slave Driver's Hand build. because if we get Slave Driver's Hand, then we can go for Glorious Vanity for the gain life as ES Keystone, and then we can just have our life pool be the sustain or the cost mechanic for our traps. Unfortunately, since we threw too fast, we couldn't do that. I forgot about Arcane Surge, but Arcane Surge never procs because we're spending Energy Shield and we're not spending mana. So Flame Dash pretty much by itself. You could end up adding in additional supports. You probably could go for a fully linked up Lightning Warp, which might be a better feels good movement skill than Flame Dash. That's kind of up to you. Obviously, there's room in the build for you guys to improve and add in gem links because I was so lazy about doing it myself. So I'm kind of sorry about that, but it's just, it was working with what I had, and I'm kind of bad at updating things once they're already good and they're already working, and if I don't have any obvious ideas for what I want to do with it. For our main damage setup, we did Eye of Winter with Divergent Charge Traps. I'd recommend Divergent because it gives you 10% trap trigger radius per power charge, which I think is really good for making your traps trigger from farther away and more consistently trigger. So I like this support alternate quality. And then we also did increased crit supports just to get our crit. I think we got pretty much capped. Once we have power charges, I think we're at like 95% plus crit chance. Very good crit chance with this. When we get a Essence of Horror pair of gloves, you could swap this out for trap and mind damage. And Anomalous Cluster support is here for the trap throw speed. I don't know if you necessarily need the alternate quality because the alternate quality gives us trap throw speed, and again, we had a little bit too much trap throw speed, and maybe you should just use the other alternate qualities that either make the traps go closer together or the alternate quality that makes you just get more trap damage. That's up to you. Don't necessarily go for Anomalous Cluster Trap support because we were throwing traps too quickly, I believe, and thus bricking our build a little bit, and it's a good way you could take some throw speed off. I just didn't want to go switch it out because I had taken time to bought it. Anyways, I'm lazy. That's all you need to know. As for damage setup, when you're playing a boss, we have 3 things we do, which is Orb of Storms from our Eye of Malice to subtract 50 cold res, our Hydrosphere for our Eye of Winter to chain off things, and our Arcanist Brand to get Sniper's Mark, which is huge for damage, as well as Frostbomb for the better exposure and the no life regen, just to negate Maven being annoying and regenning monsters and bosses. So it goes like this. We go up to a boss fight, we put all these 3 things down, and then we start chucking traps. We have a lot of speed. We'll have more with like frenzy charges and whatnot, so it's easier to proc these things. It's a little bit more management, but they give us a lot of damage, and it's definitely worth doing on bosses. On non-bosses, it doesn't matter. You can just go around throwing traps, and it's no big deal. But when you're doing single target, you definitely want to do your Orb of Storms, you definitely want to do your Hydrosphere, and you definitely want to do your Arcanist Brand for that Sniper's Mark. So that's the setup for when you're doing a boss fight. That's the gem links. Obviously, I didn't think this through 100%, and there's probably some more min-maxing that can be done with the build, given I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 gem sockets that are things that aren't even relevant to the build. They're just basically leveling sockets if you want to level things in your offhand. I guess empowers and leveling up those gems are really, really high value this league, so maybe you just make more money doing that. Kind of up to you what you want to do there. I'll leave it to you guys to discover some cool combinations. So that's the gem links. Now let's look at the passive trees. To start off with, we went with the Deadeye here. The reason was that we did it were for chain on Eye of Winter to get extra hits. That's what I thought would be cool. It also makes Eye of Winter clear better by chaining off more monsters. Kind of nice there. And we also went for Tailwind. Now, in hindsight, I realized we had too much speed, which means maybe in another scenario where we weren't Deadeye, Architect's Hands could stay in the build if we didn't have all the speed from Tailwind. Something to keep in mind. Saboteur is a really good Ascendancy. I'm going to throw that out there just to say you can do this build as Saboteur as well, and it will probably be very strong. If you're doing Saboteur, you're going to go for the Blind Ascendancy, the First Trap Ascendancy, the Crit Multi-Pen Ascendancy, and the Blind Ascendancy. Did I already say the Blind Ascendancy? If I didn't say the Blind Ascendancy, there's also the Immune to Shock, Immune to Ignite regen Ascendancies. It's just 4 of the 2-pointer ones. They're very good. Would recommend that if you don't want to do Deadeye. If the speed is just kind of meh and you'd want to go for something that might be a little bit more consistent, Saboteur is a great option because the tree would stay pretty much the same. What you would change is instead of pathing down to these life nodes here, you would path these 2 dex nodes here. You would get rid of all this here, and you would then pick up, you know, the damage nodes here on the way to the rest of the tree. That's the main things I would change, along with the Ascendancy points. The Ascendancy points we get from Deadeye are pretty great. Focal point, a lot of damage there. Chain, really nice for extra clear. Gathering Wind, really nice for speed. And Gale Force, nice for some defenses. But I'm not convinced it's necessarily better than Saboteur. So I want to throw that out there. If you're doing this build, I think Saboteur is a great option as well. I think it could go either way. Kind of up to you what you want to do with it. If you want to be a little bit more niche and off meta, Deadeye, I'd say go that. If you want to be a little bit more consistent power, I think Saboteur ultimately in the end would be a stronger Ascendancy. So that's that. For the rest of the tree, we did do some special things that I should make note of. We went for reduced projectile speed. Eye of Winter benefits similarly to a Ball Lightning, where it gets more single target in by moving slower. Because our traps are always going to be really close to the boss, if the projectile has all of its projectile speed, it'll zoom past the boss, and it will get less of its damage multiplier and less hits on the boss. So we want to reduce that speed as much as we can. We did this by things like slower projectiles and these reduced projectile speed nodes here. And so that's why we're traveling to these. We prioritize them because I think they're pretty high value for getting some extra damage out of Eye of Winter, similarly to what you would do with Ball Lightning. Also, we grab Phase Acro, very important for dodge. The trap clusters, we ended up foregoing the trap speed nodes, which I originally picked up because we needed less speed, so we went for this side of the wheel here. And of course, those nodes are great damage value. Then we went for things like Saboteur, and we anointed Master Sapper specifically to get additional traps because our trap throw speed was too fast for the arm time, which I mentioned earlier. And we went for a Corrupted Blood Immunity Hair Trigger. I'm not sure we need Hair Trigger or not. I never tested without Hair Trigger if our traps still triggered pretty consistently. I'll leave that up to you to test if you want to. I just knew this was a cheap jewel I could get with Corrupted Blood Immunity, and it would just mean our trap triggers were more consistent. After that, we went for things like Power Charge, some solid crit nodes, life nodes, crit nodes, power charge, life nodes, crit nodes, power charge. It looks super awkward starting at Deadeye, going all the way around the tree, but luckily we do get some nice value out of nodes we are traveling next to. Eldritch Battery we're always going to need for Tinkerskin, Trap Throw, Sustain until we get something like a Glorious Vanity if we did Slave Drivers, but we can't do Slave Drivers like I said before. And then other things we get on the way are super high value, like the Power Charge cluster here, the Power Charge nodes on the way, as well as Life and the crit nodes all along the outer side of the tree. So although it looks kind of awkward with pathing, I think it worked decently well, and I'm okay with it, even though we are traveling halfway around the entire passive tree itself. So that's the passive tree. Let's look at Pantheons. For Pantheons, I decided to go with Solo Brine King, specifically so we can't get stun locked, and we can have 50% reduced effect of chill. We already have freeze immunity from Arctic Armor, and we already have immunity from pretty much all the other ailments via our Lazy Flask setup, so taking care of chill, making it have reduced effect was just another step in not feeling like ailments are killing us. After that, we went for Soul of Yugal specifically for reduced effect of curses, so that way curse maps wouldn't feel so bad as well. There are some other great options like reduced effect of physical damage over time, chance to avoid bleeding, and you can only have 5 Corrupted Bloods on you. This is another great option I would recommend as well if you are not going the Lazy Flask route and you're going to have to deal with bleeding more often. That's something I would look into. So that's the passive tree, that's the Pantheon, that's the gear, that's the gem links, that's the majority of what we have here with the Deadeye Trapper. All in all, good DPS character, not too expensive, but it's slow clear speed. Clear speed's just kind of meh, and it's not tanky enough to really be consistently alive. It has that feel bad element where you'll just randomly die to stuff, and that doesn't feel great. So I'd say up to you guys. I don't know what all your preferences are, but maybe this sounds like a build up your alley. Maybe it isn't. Hopefully either way you enjoyed seeing the character and what we did with it. And on the next character, probably going to end up going for a Giga Tanky character. Hopefully I can make something Giga Tanky that also has DPS, but man, that's a hard ask. We will see. Thanks for watching as always, guys. I will see you later. Peace out, Exiles.